So what I will talk about is this thing called liberty. I'll tell you what I think of liberty in the context of Mexico in particular as an application of what I consider to be a malevolent entity. And I'll talk about it in relation to Father Fahey and Pope Pius XI. Now, as Father Fahey observed in his work, The Mystical Body of Christ, in the modern world, the long war against the social kingship began with the Protestant revolt. I call Martin Luther patient zero in a civilizational disease. And that revolt destroyed the unity of Christendom and opened the way to the absolutism of the state, as Father Fahey shows. Because without the church, which John rightly calls the extension of Christ in time, state absolutism becomes inevitable. And what is the name under which the forces opposed to the social kingship, the name uttered by every rebel, every revolutionary, every dictator who has fastened himself upon the people since the long revolt against the social kingship began? What is the name under which they proceed? They call it liberty. And what is liberty? I've said it before, I'll say it again. Liberty is just another name for power. Power unchecked by the church as intermediary body, as the extension of Christ in time, unchecked by anything higher than the authority of the current occupant of political office. If I could sum up liberty in one phrase, it would be this: the total emancipation of the body politic from the influence of the Catholic Church. Or even more concisely, liberty means Catholic no more. That's it, in socio-political terms. Now, there was no greater defender of the social kingship doctrine than Pius XI, as Father Fahey recognized. And he gave us two encyclicals upholding that doctrine. In his inaugural encyclical, Ubi Arcano Dei, he said, don't think that the League of Nations here in the interwar period is going to prevent another calamity. There is no League of Nations worthy of the name except Christendom. There is no peace worthy of the name other than the peace of Christ. And without it, we're going to descend into an even greater calamity, as Our Lady of Fatima predicted. A worse war will come unless men cease offending God. And then in Quas Primus, he proclaimed the feast of Christ the King, to remind a rebellious world of who its king really is. That was one of his intentions in promulgating the feast, to shake up the world a bit. Now, Father Fahey rightly focuses on the teaching of Pius XI in his works on the social kingship. And it was he, Pius XI, who had to deal with a key example of the war against the social kingship during his long pontificate. I'm speaking here of the case of Catholic Mexico. That will be my focus today. Now, in Catholic Mexico, liberty was installed according to what I call the playbook of liberty. It's a 10-point plan. Number one, trump up some grievance. Number two, stage an insurrection in a major city. Paris, Philadelphia, Boston, Mexico City, you name it. Then declare a provisional government. Point three, if there's a king, kill the king. If there's a Catholic leader who gets in the way, let's say Gabriel Garcia Moreno or Engelbert Dollfuss, assassinate him. Then declare a democratic republic of the people. Then have a fake plebiscite to adopt a new constitution, like the plebiscite of 1861 that John and I talk about, where you could vote yes or no, but you had to show what your vote was as you put it in the box. Amazingly enough, what yes votes were 99% of the total. Then you have a civil marriage and divorce. Absolutely essential to introduce civil marriage and divorce and the civil registry of births and deaths. And then persecute the priests, of course, killing as many as necessary, along with the bishops. And then, of course, confiscate all of the church's property and declare it a national endowment. And then finally, the key to securing the gains of liberty, public education. There must be a public educational system. And that's the program that was followed in Mexico. During his pontificate, Pius XI had to deal with the Mexican Revolution of 1910 and the radically anti-clerical Mexican Constitution of 1917. Here's something that Ambrose Coleman wrote in his book, Friars in the Philippines, at the turn of the 20th century. He said that while the Mexican people were, for the most part, devoutly Catholic, the politicians are Masonic. And as a consequence, the church has been despoiled of her property and visited with persecution. And he observed further that in Mexico, Catholics somehow or other permit themselves to be persecuted by Masonic politicians. We'll see shortly that that came to an end briefly during the Cristero War. As with the Catholic uprising in the Vendée, government violence would finally be met by counter-revolutionary resistance. Now, given the intrinsic opposition between liberty and anything resembling Catholic social order, it was only a matter of time before the junta in Mexico resorted to full-scale repression of the church. And these measures echoed the measures of the Jacobin regime. In fact, when they assassinated Maximilian I of Mexico back in 1867, before all of this began, they did so to the tune of the Marseillaise. That was only the beginning. So the Mexican Revolution of 1910 would convulse the nation for about 10 years. The true revolutionary goal, as always, in Catholic countries, was the suppression of the church under the weight of a centralized secular state imposed by force wherever necessary. Again, that 10-point plan I outlined for you. Now, 5 years before Pius XI ascended to the papal throne, the National Assembly, the equivalent of the National Assembly in Mexico, enacted the anti-clerical Constitution of 1917. It's still in effect today, with various amendments that mitigated somewhat, but nothing like an entire repeal of that document. And its adoption followed, isn't this surprising, United States support from the Woodrow Wilson regime. He was going to make Mexico safe for democracy even before he made the world safe for democracy at Versailles. And that way, as we see with the result after Versailles, freed from the inconvenient impediment of kings and emperors, the people of Europe could enjoy the fresh air of freedom under Nazism in the West and communism in the East. Now, back in Mexico, the overthrown President Huerta had himself come to power with government assistance from the United States by overthrowing President Madero, also with Wilson's support. So his about-face regarding Huerta followed upon his recognition that his meddling in Mexican affairs had been basically a disaster. But here's what he said to an interviewer, and I quote, "My ideal is an orderly and righteous government in Mexico, but my passion is for the submerged 85% of the people of that republic who are now struggling toward liberty." End quote. That's right, liberty. But the 85% he was talking about weren't struggling toward liberty. They were struggling to be Catholics. And this is where we see that liberty is the antithesis of Catholic social order. If there is Catholic social order, there is no liberty. Liberty means a secular republic in which the influence of the Catholic Church and institutions and laws is completely eliminated. That is all liberty has ever been about in the sense in which I'm talking about it, in the modern sense, in the sense of political modernity. So 5 years before he would make the world safe for liberty, at the point of a gun in Versailles, Wilson assisted the gunslinging forces of liberty in Mexico, even though he admitted that there would be an increase of violence and destruction. The historian Samuel Blythe has noted that Wilson was undeterred by this knowledge. Quote, "People at home and abroad thought the president's attitude was grossly irresponsible. From their point of view, he had stripped away the last illusion of safety in Mexico and left foreigners exposed to all sorts of rebel atrocities. Both in Europe and in the United States, most people regarded the constitutionalists as bandits and demanded American intervention to end the revolution and restore order. Instead, we had American intervention to foment the revolution." Now, the fruit of the revolution that Wilson enabled was the 1917 Constitution, which finally enshrined in Mexico's law the sine qua non of liberty, total separation of church and state. But it didn't stop there. It ensured separation of church and state along the following lines. Quote, "The historic principle of separation of the state and the churches guides the norms contained in the present article." End quote. The historic principle. So by now, liberty considered it a matter of historical principle that the church be separated from the state. Mexicans didn't agree, but liberty doesn't really care what the people think. Liberty, this malevolent entity, tells the people what they think. So the following norms in this document subject all religious cults, supposedly indifferently, but it's actually all about the Catholic Church, to the following norms: the registration of all churches and priests, legal requirements to become a minister of any cult, a ban on religious ministers from public office, and quotas for priests to be established within each of the Mexican states. Article 130 also says that there is no permission for the association of religious ministers for any political purpose, for any preaching against a political candidate, for any religious opposition to laws or institutions, for any insults to patriotic symbols in the form of public meetings, religious acts, or religious propaganda. And then, for good measure, Article 130 bans the wearing of clerical garb in public and prohibits the formation of any class of political groups with a title containing any word or other indication of relation with any religious denomination or any meeting of a political character in temples. And then under Article 24, we find every religious act of public worship must be performed strictly inside places of public worship, which shall at all times be under governmental supervision. And as to those places, in an echo of 1789, again, my 10-point plan for liberty, all church property was converted into a national endowment at the government's disposal, not including hospitals and schools. And this with the support of the United States. Now, with the radical separation of the state, not only from the church, but from any publicly visible vestige of religion under the norms of Article 130 and Article 24, came as well the separation of public education from any religious influence. Quote, the Constitution requires that public education be secular and not include religious doctrine. This is absolutely essential to the establishment of liberty in any Catholic country. There must be a public educational system. Otherwise, the revolution will fail, as we see in a few moments. Thus, religious instruction was forbidden in all schools, public or private, and Catholic doctrine could be taught only within the confines of a church edifice. Now, 9 years later came the crowning blow, which prompted Pius XI's first intervention, the so-called Calles law, enacted in July of 1926 to enforce this draconian constitution. Calles had come to power with United States support, of course. And of course, Calles was a Freemason, as if there could be any doubt. He was a member of the sect of the Helios Lodge in his hometown of Guaymas, and at one time he was the secretary of that lodge. If you want to look up famous Freemasons involved in all these revolutions, get a book, 2 volume set, Denslow and Truman. That's Harry Truman. 10,000 famous Freemasons, all in alphabetical order for you to look up. You'll see that about 80% of the key revolutionaries were members of one Masonic lodge or paramasonic society or another. Now, as the historian Michael Gonzalez says of Calles, quote, as an avowed atheist and anti-cleric, Calles' hatred of the church was unmatched among revolutionary presidents. So he was the very embodiment of liberty, liberty incarnate. Now, this document, this Calles law, was purportedly enacted to interpret and enforce the 1917 Constitution, and it did so with draconian rigor, including prison terms of up to 5 years for any violations. Matthew Butler is a Mexican history specialist at the University of Texas, and he observes that, by comparison, isn't this strange, Protestant worship continued without hindrance after July 26, the date the Calles law was enacted. Further, he says, Protestant pastors were given control of their churches, a perquisite denied to Catholic curas, whose churches passed into the hands of municipal juntas as state property. So here we encounter liberty's intrinsic antipathy toward the Catholic Church as bimillennial pillar of social order, as opposed to the Protestant sects, whose disparate beliefs and practices arose precisely from a rejection of that authority of the church in the constitution of social order. So in that respect, there's always been a kind of affinity between the Protestant mentality, the idea of private judgment, and the modern state system. And under that system, they are perfectly prepared to listen to politicians who consider themselves unbound, or at least declare themselves to be unbound, by the dictates of divine revelation as manifested in the social kingship of Christ. There is one noble exception. In my book, Liberty, the God That Failed, I note the activities of a Protestant movement, evangelical Protestants, during the Civil War, called the National Reform Association, who called for an amendment of the preamble of the Constitution to acknowledge that the revealed will of Christ is the law of the land. These Protestants were advocating the social kingship of Christ, but because of the principle of Protestant judgment, when they were confronted with the accusation that they were trying to impose their morality on the nation, well, they replied, no, we're talking about their morality agreed upon by the majority. So they annihilated their own movement. But they did submit the proposed amendment to President Lincoln, who submitted it to Congress, and it died in committee. Because the committee said, no, the Constitution was designed to let everyone, believer and non-believer, exercise political authority. It never got out of committee. So the Pius law being engrafted onto the 1917 Constitution prompted Pius XI's first intervention in Inquius Afflictisque, November of 1926. And he says in the preamble, deserters from the army of Christ and enemies of the common Father of all have ordered and are continuing up to the present hour a cruel persecution of their own brethren, our most beloved children of Mexico. And he observed that it was not the people of Mexico who had demanded repression of the church in Mexico. Rather, he said, it was a small group of men that has so outraged the rights of God and of the church as they are now doing in Mexico. And this without the slightest regard for the past glories of their country and with no feelings of pity for their fellow citizens. And this is how liberty always advances. The revolutionary cadre imposes its will on the hapless masses, and they submit, or at some point they try to rebel, and they're killed en masse so that they can have liberty. This is how it works, you see. Mexico's anti-clerical cabal, said Pius, have done away with the liberties of the majority, and in such a clever way, they've been able to clothe their lawless actions with the semblance of legality. As I said, fake plebiscites, constitutions promulgated by a tiny minority of activists, which are then imposed upon the people at the point of a gun. If you resist, you're killed. It's that simple. But this outcome was only typical, said Pius, of the frequent revolutions of modern times, which have ended in the majority of cases in trials for the church and persecutions of religion, end quote. Revolution is the mainspring of the operations of liberty. Revolution, according to the social compact theory of John Locke, is how liberty proceeds to arrogate to itself power over the majority that never wanted a revolution. This idea that any Tom, Dick, or Harry can proclaim a breach of the social compact and begin a revolution has no place in Catholic teaching. It's a novelty in political philosophy that provided the means by which liberty could proclaim itself on the grounds that the social compact had been breached. So we, the concerned citizens, we, the revolutionary elites, have the right to bring liberty to the masses because of this breach of the social compact. Now, under the 1917 Constitution, Pius said, the civil authority is given the right to interfere in matters of divine worship and in the external discipline of the church. Priests are put on the level of professional men. They must not only be Mexicans by birth and cannot exceed a certain number specified by law, but are at the same time deprived of all civil and political rights. They are thus placed in the same class with criminals and the insane. This is Mexico, right next door to us. Further, he said, the vows of religious orders and religious congregations are outlawed. Divine worship is forbidden unless it takes place within the confines of the church and is carried out under the watchful eye of the government. And just as under the Jacobin regime and all such similar regimes imposed in the name of liberty, he said, and I quote, all church buildings have been declared the property of the state. Episcopal residences, diocesan offices, seminaries, religious houses, hospitals, charitable institutions have been taken away from the church and handed over to the state. As a matter of fact, the church can no longer own property of any kind. Further, according to the 1917 Constitution, there was, of course, a total secularization of education. Pius lamented that, and I quote, "Priests and religious are forbidden to open or conduct elementary schools. It is not permitted to teach children their religion, even in a private school. And diplomas or decrees conferred by private schools have no value and are not recognized by the state." So here, the revolutionary government of Mexico achieved the primary objective of liberty, the imposition of public education as the primary means of negating the influence of the church over the body politic going forward after all the violence. Because you have to remake people in order to make them submissive to the revolutionary will.